Who is Belinda Royall Sutton? Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the Noble House of Belmont. And today we're going to be diving into the story of a remarkable woman from history named Belinda Royall Sutton. But first, let me go ahead and make a quick video introduction in regards to who she is and her incredible journey. Let's get started.
This is how a formerly enslaved woman became the first person in Massachusetts to fight for reparations and win. Almost. Belinda Sutton lived here at the Royal House, in what is now the city of Medford, just outside Boston. 200 years ago, this was a sprawling plantation. She was among the dozens of enslaved people who labored here.
50 years, her faithful hands have been compelled to ignoble servitude for the benefit of an Isaac Royall, until the terror of men armed in the cause of freedom compelled her master to fly. I mean, what an amazing passage, right?
Historian Kiara Singleton showed me the original petition Belinda Sutton filed.
It's quite amazing. I mean, we do not have many documents like this from Black women in the 18th century.
Belinda Sutton filed the petition after becoming emancipated from her enslaver's estate in 1783.
She starts with talking about where she grew up, which
Now, brothers and sisters, this time frame is important because in 1783, we know this was right after the American Revolutionary War, was right after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which was the document that gave the United States the ability to exist as a free and sovereign nation, for them to continue to keep doing whatever monopoly or enterprise that they felt for them to exist, and for them to be considered one of the contending party or powers here on the international realm. So to understand that this time frame especially is important to know, is because in 1740, this was during the Anti-Literacy Act era, which said that those who were so-called African Americans or Black or Negro, they were not legally or lawfully able to learn how to read and write, and anyone who was teaching them how to read and write would be punished because of the violation that's pretty much taking place. So for her to have this petition put in during this time, because the Anti-Literacy Act actually wasn't over until after the Civil War, which is like 1865-66. So this is remarkable, and on top of the fact that she was considered one of the first women of that nature, after those who came before her, who were actually signed for their freedom or fought for their freedom, like Elizabeth Key Greenstead and Eliza Freeman, who was in the 17 and the 1600s, but the early 1700s and the later 1600s. And for her sister Belinda Royall Sutton to have hers being done in the later part of the 1700s, after Great Britain and the United States broke away, is very remarkable. But let's go ahead and continue into the video.
Belinda Sutton is making it very clear that not only did she have a homeland, but she had a family, and slavery was the reason why she was taken away from both her home and her family. So what we can think about is that she is a part of this active, rich Black abolitionist and radical Black community who are at the front lines of not only demanding for their freedom, but also demanding for the freedom of all Black people in the state of Massachusetts.
What can you tell me about the process Belinda went through to petition?
What we do know is that Belinda Sutton is illiterate, and we know that because she signs her petition with an X. She would have dictated her story, and then she would have filed it with the Massachusetts legislature. And the court says, we agree with you. We do think you deserve to be compensated.
But Singleton believes the legislature only approved Belinda Sutton's petition for reparations to punish the royal family for picking the wrong side in the Revolutionary War.
I want to be very clear. that legislature is not saying, yes, we are actively and willingly wanting to give money to this 70-year-old Black woman just out of the kindness of their heart. What they're doing is saying, there's a new government in town, and the Royals were loyalists. She was enslaved by one of the wealthiest enslavers in all of New England. And so it really is a way for them to try to punish people like the Royals. So the legislature gives her an annual settlement of 15 pounds and 12 shillings, which is supposed to help her survive and take care of a daughter who is sick. She gets that payment only twice. While it is important that she wins that judgment, it's even more important that she doesn't get all of that money and that she keeps fighting for that money because she needs it, but also because she's owed it. But what it does, it shows us the ways in which Black people are putting pressure on, the government, on elected officials to actually live up to the promises of freedom.
Particularly because when we think about New England and the height of the transatlantic slave trade, people are talking about the abolitionist movement. That means that there's a lot of white help and white advocacy. But Belinda, I think, is a testament to Black people doing their own thing.
Yeah, Black people have always been their own abolitionists. And generally we have told the story of abolitionists through white judges and lawyers and activists. But Black people have always been at the center of that movement as well. So when we say that this document helps us understand reparations, I think it really does do the work that so many people are grappling with today. How does, in Belinda's case, slavery, but then today a long history of structural racism and inequality prevent Black people from being able to determine their own lives and livelihood?
Belinda Sutton's cause lives on, and in 2024, there are many different questions about reparations. I did a whole podcast about it. It's called What is Owed? You can find it here.
Okay. So that was a glimpse into the life of Belinda Royall Sutton. Nothing real fancy in that introduction video. Just kind of give you an idea of what happened, who she was, who was the so-called slave owner, why they so-called went forward with giving her reparations, and what ended up happening to her later in life didn't touch on. But as we can see, that was one of the first cases in regards to reparations to anyone of melanated, and are we going to say Berber descent, but for lack of a better word, which they say African American or Black, which we don't prescribe to those terms because they're nothing more than legal fictions, which they call political social constructs. So, but anywho, Belinda, as we see, was a so-called enslaved African woman in the late 18th century, living in Massachusetts after the Revolutionary War. She petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for reparations for years of enslavement, as we see, becoming one of the earliest known instances of such a request in American history. And during that period, America was grappling with the contradictions of freedom and slavery as the new nation sought to define its identity and principles. Belinda's courage, as we see, was to seek justice against all the odds that was highlighted, which brought in a powerful narrative of how strong of the position she felt in regards to her getting what she knew was owed to her. But we need to dive a little bit further in regards to who Belinda Royall Sutton is, because a lot of information still need to be uncovered. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what we're able to find from not only Wikipedia, but a few other sources. So once again, brothers and sisters, please like, share, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell, so therefore you'll be notified when a new video has been uploaded or if I go live. Also, too, don't forget to check out the Third Temple English Church of England page, headed by the de jure King of England, King Clifford Jefferson from the Royal House of Plantagenet. Those of you who know who we are and what we have come to do, we come to bring the enlightenment to those long lost heirs, descendants of the Kingdom of England, Great Britain, who are domiciled amongst you in the so-called territory of the United States. They just lost their conscience. They forgot about, these historical events that took place. And as us being trustees, it is our obligation to bring this information to them, so therefore they can be protected moving forward in this day and age that we're living in. So let's continue. All right, so it says Belinda Sutton, born 1713 in the western part of the African continent. Now, why knowing dates are important and putting things in a historical context and regarding what was taking place, who was the running occupiers, aka the government, things of that nature. You have to know this, so therefore things will make sense when we start trying to uncover and investigate further regarding the identity of Sister Belinda Royall Sutton. So, born in 1713 in the western part of Africa, the continent, they said, which was Ghana. All right, Ghana was known as the Ivory Gold Coast, and that's where we know that Ghana was one of the locations that was occupied by which we call the Royal African Company, that was started by the House of Stewards. All right, and those of you know the House of Stewards are actually the descendants from the Kingdom of Scotland. The Kingdom of Scotland, because of Elizabeth I didn't have a proper heir to inherit, then it was given to her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, who became known as James I of England. And James I of England had heirs, and these heirs, as you can see, based off of which we're going to go ahead and show, started the enterprise known as the Royal African Company, utilizing the rights and the prerogatives of the English, which and who they were not. All right, so it says, also known as Belinda Royall, was a woman born in that what is now Ghana, like I said, now known as Ghana, and was enslaved by the royal family at the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Massachusetts. Additional details of Sutton's family life are under ongoing research. Baptism records for a son, Joseph, and a daughter, Prine, appear in church records. Belinda was abandoned by Isaac Royall Jr. when he fled to Nova Scotia at the beginning of the American Revolution. In Royall's will, a number of enslaved people are listed, but Belinda was unique in his wishes. So we need to know, and it's important to get an idea who is this Isaac Royall Jr., who claimed to abandon Sister Belinda Royall Sutton. So let's go ahead and get a look at Mr. Isaac Royall Jr. Colonel Isaac Royall Jr., 1719 to 1781. Now, we must be careful in taking the images that we see during this time as face value, especially as I've shown you through the iconoclast era, which they destroyed a lot of the original artwork. And a lot of that artwork, since it was destroyed, they allowed new artists licenses to recreate these artworks, and they create these artworks in what they felt that the people should have looked like. All right, and most of the time it was never really the right people who they were replacing. All right, so this brother named Colonel Isaac Royall Jr., and the reason why I say that is because let's take a look in regards to where he come from. It says, politician, slave trader, military officer who spent the majority of his life in the province of Massachusetts Bay. Early life. Royall was born in 1719 in the British colony of Antigua. Now, we all know where Antigua is. Antigua is in the Caribbean. Antigua, also known as Waladi or Wadadadi by the local population, and the island in the Lesser Antilles, is one of the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean region and the most populous island in the country of Antigua and Barbuda. Antigua and Barbuda became an independent state within the Commonwealth, blah, blah, blah. So you see, and look at the image of, Mr. Royal. And this is painted by John Singleton Copley, who painted a lot of images during this time of a lot of people, as we can see. So just based off of that territory and this image, it doesn't look like he'd been touched by the sun in Antigua, period. Especially if you were born there. There's no way in the world. All right, so, that's going to be my opinion right now, but I'll leave that up to you, brothers and sisters, as we continue to read. It says, he was born to Isaac Royall Sr. and Elizabeth Brown. Now, those of us who know the surname Brown, it meant your complexion. Only those who were named Brown for a surname meant that their complexion were brown. And based off of that, from my assumption and the territory he was born in, I would expect that Mr. Isaac Royall will be brown as well. Whatever you brothers and sisters think, leave it down there at the bottom of the comment, because I want to get some dialogue here, because history, if we have been told, is not what we think. That's the reason why it's important for us to start going back in time and get a better look, because you may realize what you have been hating all your life is actually yourself. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. It said his father was born in North Yarmouth in modern-day Maine before moving to Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1675. Isaac had eventually settled in Antigua, purchasing a slave plantation on the island in 1700. He also traded rum, sugar, and slaves. So let's speak about his father. In 1736, when Royall was 17, British colonial officials in Antigua gained wind of a planned slave rebellion among the colony slaves, responded with a brutal crackdown. Total of 132 enslaved persons were convicted, 88 executed. 5 by being broken the will, blah, blah, blah. Read the rest of this. I mean, it's horrible stuff, but we want to get to the meat of this information. All right, I think this legacy. All right, it says in 1779, Royall emancipated his slave Belinda Royall, one of the 64 slaves they owed in Medford, and directed she be paid a pension funded by his estate. Belinda had to petition the Massachusetts legislature 6 times to receive her due. Her successful 1783 lawsuit became one of the first instances of reparations for slavery in the United States. You hear this? So her case, or her situation, was one of the first ones in the United States. Prior to the United States, everything was still underneath the British occupation, and there were previous cases, as I spoke about earlier, for seeking for actually freedom. I want to say reparations. I would say seeking for freedom, but so in this case, reparations. All right. So in Royall's will, he also left land to Harvard College to help the institution establish its first law professorship. This bequest led to the founding of Harvard Law School in 1817. All right, in 1936, to celebrate Harvard University, tercentenary Harvard alumnus and former Professor Pierre de Chagnon, forgive me, La Rose, created the coat of arms for each of Harvard's graduate schools. All right, and the rest of that, you can just read that for yourself. That's not the important part. I'm speaking now. All right, so we got an idea. It's Mr. Isaac Royall. All right, so let's go back to Belinda. All right, so it says in his will, he gave his slave Belinda the option of freedom, and he further provided that she get security, that she shall not be a charge in the town of Medford. If she did not elect freedom, he bequeathed her to his daughter, Mary Irving. Other slaves were bequeathed and some were sold, but Belinda was emancipated. In February 1783, Sutton presented a petition to the Massachusetts General Court requesting a pension from the proceeds of her enslaver's estate. The vivid petition text was crafted to describe Belinda's kidnapping in Africa. Now pay attention, because they're saying that she was, A, when we originally heard from the video, that she was illiterate. B, we know this was during the time of the Anti-Literacy Act, so chances are of her being illiterate is is high. But C, she knows that she was enslaved or kidnapped around the age of 12, and they're not telling us if her name Belinda was the name that she had when she got kidnapped, or was that the name that it was eventually changed to. But my assumption, if she was kidnapped at around the age 11 or 12, she should knew what her name was, regardless. And that's not something that's easy, you're going to just forget. And not saying she couldn't have, because of how much time had went by. But just for the sake of the argument, I would expect that Belinda probably was the name she had. Okay? All right, so it says, so the vivid petition text was crafted to describe Belinda's kidnapping in Africa, aka in Ghana, and subsequent hardships, and to condemn the practice of slavery. Some scholars suggest that she was assisted by Prince Hall, a local free African American anti-slavery activist of the Revolutionary War era. Also, Prince Hall was known as a Freemason, and he was also too the founder of the Prince Hall Freemasonic Lodge, was known as the African Lodge 469, and then changed over to the first African Lodge over here in so-called America. But we're going to talk a little bit more about Mr. Prince Hall here momentarily. So it says, other scholars point to the wider black community and the collective knowledge of prior legal cases in the Commonwealth. The first petition request suggested Sutton was the major supporter of her daughter. She prays that such allowance may be made her of the estate of Colonel Royall as will prevent her and her more infirm daughter from misery in the greatest extreme and scatter comfort over the short and downward path of their lives. As a result of this petition, an annual pension of £15 and 12 shillings was awarded to her and approved by John Hancock. This pension has been cited as one of the first cases of reparation for slavery and the slave trade. In the 1788 petition, she's referred to as a widow and used the last name Sutton. All right. Subsequent petitions to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts indicate that after 2 initial payments, the pension payments were not forthcoming. She continued to petition for the back payments until a final filing in 1793. Later, legal documents refer to the royal servants' deaths having transpired, but when and under what circumstances remain unknown at the time. Okay. So, as we can see, Sister Belinda Royall Sutton had the very first reparation case in America. All right, and at first, she was having issues getting through until they did. She started getting paid, and then eventually it stopped, and then her demise and what happened, went unknown at that point. The rest of this, you can take a look at, but what I wanted to get to was, because they didn't speak much on the rest of the page, but it did say that it was written by potentially Prince Hall. So let's go and take a look at this Mr. Prince Hall, shall we? Prince Hall. Now, clearly he was literate if he wrote her petition. She was illiterate based off of what they said, and he said or spoke in regards to her coming from Africa, and dealing with, all of this trauma or traumatic experience from slavery. So he was able to tailor it and pull your emotional side from his words, which is clever. But we still need to know who is Prince Hall. So Prince Hall says 1735 to December 1807 was an American abolitionist and leader in the free black community in Boston. All right. And we know the free black community in the British colonies in North America and the United States before the abolition of slavery in 1865. Free Negro or free black described the legal status of African Americans who were not enslaved. So this is before slavery. This is before the American Revolutionary War, and as well as we see after. So it says the term was applied both to formerly enslaved people and to those It's important to go further on this page. The term applied both to formerly enslaved people and to those who had been born free. Free people of color, whether of African or mixed descent. Pay attention. So it's saying that there was so-called free Negroes, and we know the term Negro means Berber, but for the sake of argument, we're going to just say Negro. So there were free Negroes in the British colonies during the time of the British occupation, even afterwards, during the time when so-called Negroes were still enslaved after the American Revolutionary War, all the way up until 1865. So according to this, Prince Hall was that, and leader in the free black community. All right, so he says, so he founded the Prince Hall Freemasonry. And as you say, Prince Hall Freemasonic or Freemasonry is a branch of North American Freemasonry created for African Americans, founded by Prince Hall on September 29, 1784. Prince Hall Freemasonry is the oldest and largest predominantly African American fraternity in the United States. Now, I definitely don't think it's a coincidence the fact that he started this a year after the American Revolutionary War and the same year of the what's the word I'm thinking of? The ratification of the Treaty of Paris, which was done January 14, 1784, which wasn't properly ratified, by the way. And it says he founded Prince Hall, I already said, and lobbied for education rights for African American children. He was also active in the Back to Africa movement. Now, this is going to be very important, all right, because he wasn't petitioning for her to go back to Africa, but as we can see, he was active in that Back to Africa movement. It said he tried to gain a place for New York's enslaved and free blacks in Freemasonry, education, in the military, some of the most crucial spheres of society in this time. Hall is considered the founder of black Freemasonry in the United States, known today as Prince Hall Freemasonry. He formed the African Grand Lodge of North America and was unanimously elected as Grand Master and served until he died in 1807. Now, 1807 was also the same year that Great Britain abolished slavery. I repeat, 1807 is the same year that Great Britain abolished slavery. All right. It says this, Steve Gladstone, author of the Freedom Trail, Boston, states that Hall was one of the most influential free black leaders in the late 1700s. All right, we see he was born in New England Territory, died in Boston, Massachusetts. All right. We want to get to So we want to get to this. We're just going to read this. The Black Masons had limited power. They could meet as a lodge, participate in the Masonic procession on St. John's Day, and bury their dead with Masonic rites, but could not confer Masonic degrees or perform any other essential functions of a fully operating lodge. Unable to create a charter, they applied to the Grand Lodge of England. The Grand Master of the Mother Grand Lodge of England, H.R.H., the Duke of Cumberland, issued a charter for the African Lodge Number 1, later renamed African Lodge Number 459, September 29, 1784. The lodge was the country's first African Masonic lodge. On March 22, 1797, Hall organized a lodge in Philadelphia called African Lodge 459 under what was known as Prince Hall's Charter. They later received their own charter. On June 25, 1797, he organized the African Lodge, later known as Hiram Lodge Number 3, at Providence, Rhode Island. Now, why this is important? A, we see that they weren't able to start a lodge as so-called Black Masons. All right? So they had to go where? B, to the Mother Grand Lodge of England. So he went to England to get a charter, which he did, which the Duke of Cumberland gave and issued to him underneath the African Lodge Number 1. And the same year did they pass they did the ratification of the Treaty of Paris. So you mean to tell me an African American, aka a free black in America at the time, was able to go to England, who's the mother country of the people who they're so-called fighting against, to receive a charter to start their own Masonry lodge? There's more. Let's continue, because you're going to ask yourself, why did they do that? Now, it's called the Africa Lodge Number 1. We already know in 1740 the South Carolina Negro Act was passed to call all those Negroes who are regionally ancient Berbers, call them Negroes. Or those Africans who they call Negroes, they were ancient Berbers. But yet the lodge is called African. And at that time it was underneath the auspices of Great Britain. We know, even though it says the Grand Lodge of England, this has still been off the auspices of Great Britain, even though they're utilizing the rights and prerogatives of the Kingdom of England, because Masonry came to England underneath Ethelstan. All right? King Ethelstan was known as the father of Masonry in England. Okay? And he looked just like us, which is, like I said, something you got to start asking yourself, like, why? Something's taking place right here. Let's continue. Author and historian James Sidbury wrote, pay attention, Prince Hall and those who joined him to found Boston's African Masonic Lodge built a fundamentally new African movement on a pre-existing institutional foundation. Within that movement, they asserted emotional, mythical, and genealogical links to the continent of Africa and its people. You see? Based off of what the Doom movement, that Back to Africa movement, they built it off of inserting emotional, mythical, genealogical links to the continent of Africa and its people. So they was creating fake bloodlines off of people who truly didn't come from Africa. How can we say, is this the case? Well, let's go further with Sister Belinda Royall Sutton, because they already told you she couldn't read and write. So she wasn't the one that wrote her petition. And you saw how he was grabbing on their heartstrings in regard to the emotional tone that he was utilizing in the petition. In the time that she was born, she was in the territory of Ghana, which we already said was underneath the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company. Let's go ahead and read it. The Royal African Company, called RAC, was an English trading company established in 1660 by the House of Stuart and the City of London merchants to trade along the West African coast. Now, didn't it say that that's where she was where she come from? Ghana, which is in West Africa coast? Yeah, let's continue. It was overseen by the Duke of York, the brother of Charles II of England. The RAC was founded after Charles II ascended to the English throne in the 1660 Stuart Restoration, and he granted it a monopoly on all English trade with Africa. All right, so as you can see, Charles Stuart II, from the house of, from the Kingdom of Scotland, because they're descendants from the Kingdom of Scotland, is utilizing the rights and the prerogatives of the English. How can we tell? Look to the right of the crest. In the left candid, or left-hand corner of the shield, you see what you see on our family crest from the Royal House of Plantagenet, which goes back to King Edward I. So you see the Seal of England, which is the three lions, and then you also see the three fleur-de-lis will represent the Kingdom of France. And we know England and France is technically one and the same because of the monarchy at the time, all family, all related. The blood goes back to both of these kingdoms. And then you see over there on the right-hand side, it shows that the flag of England, which if I'm not mistaken, I want to say this was the New England flag or the Massachusetts flag, one or the other. And then it has an elephant representing Africa. And then on the right-hand side, it has two, which they would say two indigenous or aboriginals brothers from that territory. But you don't see them in any shackles or chains or anything of that nature. You see? Because they was just known as a trading company at that time. Before they were trading slaves, let's see what they were into first. Mercantile trading. They were mercantile trading. That was the industry at the time. Before they started doing slaves, let's see. So the Iraq was founded after Charles II ascended to the English throne in the 1660s Stuart Restoration, and he granted it a monopoly on all English trade with Africa, while the company's original purpose was to trade for gold in the Gambia River, as Prince Rupert of the Rhine had identified gold deposits in the region during the interregnum. The interregnum just means a pause and monarchy. The Iraq quickly began trading in slaves, who became its largest commodity. So afterwards, what they came in originally for was for gold. Then they start coming in to trade into so-called slaves. Now, they're trading slaves. They're not telling you where the slaves originally come from. Because at first, if they were coming to trade gold, and this is now the Stuarts going into the monarchy of the English, because remember, these folks were fighting against the English at the time, and not just the so-called Scottish, but you also too got to think about the Dutch slave trade, because the Dutch were in this territory as well. Let's continue reading. Historians have estimated that the Iraq shipped more African slaves to the Americas during the Atlantic slave trade than any other company. So that's telling you that the House of Stuarts shipped more so-called slaves to America than any other so-called slave company. The Iraq also dealt in other commodities such as ivory, which were primary sourced from the Gold Coast region. After William III of England rescinded the company's monopoly in 1697 under pressure from the Parliament of England, the Iraq became insolvent by 1708, though it survived in a state of much reduced activity until 1752, when its assets were transferred to the newly founded African Company of Merchants, which lasted until 1821. All right, so the Iraq was transferred, as we can see, to a new company, which still existed all the way up until 1821. Didn't really change over their occupation. It just changed over a name. Let's get down to it. It says in 1663, a new charter was obtained, which also mentioned the trade in slaves. This was the third English African company, and remember, not ran by English people, it's ran by the Scottish monarchs. But it made a fresh start in the slave trade, and there was only one factory of importance for it to take over from the East Indian Company, which had listed as a calling place on the sea route round the Cape. This was Cormenton, a few miles east of the Dutch station of Cape Coast Castle, now in Ghana. Now, didn't it say that Sister Belinda Royall Sutton comes from Ghana, based off of what was also written from the petition that Prince Hall supposedly had written, and then Prince Hall tied her connection to Africa and utilized the emotional overtones based off of what his lodge was known to create, which was emotional, mystical, or mythical genealogical connection to Africa, even though it wasn't real. All right, now we're not saying that this case it may not be real. We're just showing you during this time that the territory that we call Ghana was underneath the occupation of the Royal African Company, which was a mercantile company. And before they started trading slaves, they were doing gold. Now, she was born in the so-called 1711, 1712, around that time. So we know that they were still here. But they were known underneath that time as to time they're known as. It'll pull up. It'll pull up. They're known as another company. I did just say it, but I can't remember. All right, so it says later activities and insolvency from 1694 to 1700. That's when the original company, the port city Comenda in the Guofo Kingdom in the modern day Ghana. So it's showing you all this is taking place in Ghana. The English took two French forts and lost them again, after which the French destroyed Fort James. The place appears to have been soon regained in the War of Spanish Succession, to have been twice retaken by the French. In the Treaty of Utrecht, it remained English. The French wars caused considerable losses to the company. So as you can see, these companies were fighting back and forth regarding who is going to maintain control. But before we get there, it was one part of the company I wanted you to read where it says, what is speaking in regards to the company didn't have any sovereignty over the people and the natives, so it was an agreement. Technically, trading company, it was an agreement. Let me see. Definitely read the rest of this on your own time. I'm just trying to find the important pieces. Well, anywho, so it says dissolution. The Royal African Company was dissolved by the African Company Act 1750, with its assets being transferred to the African Company of Merchants. These principally consisted of 9 trading posts on the Gold Coast known as factories: Fort Namabo, Fort James, Fort Sekandi, Fort Winneba, Fort Apollonia, and you can read the rest of these yourself. But as you can see, all of these are in the territory we call modern day Ghana. Let's see. Here we go. Now, why that's important is because she was shipped, or she was placed into bondage at the age of 12 in the territory that was underneath the Royal African Company, which was transferred to another company underneath the British control. The British were utilizing the rights and the prerogatives of the English. And then now we need to know, who was she? Because we have to accept that people who were trading in these territories for so long had to have had family. They had to have mingled with the native folks. And then the fact that they come from England, all the this and that, we have to accept that they potentially had family there. Like it says, just because you're born in the territory don't mean that's what you originally come from. Now, she could have been born there in that territory, but the fact that her name was Belinda, and we don't know if she had that name changed, came from anything else based off of the evidence. Her look. More clues in regard to who she is and where she come from is now starting to seem that maybe she truly wasn't what they'll call Aboriginal from Ghana, but maybe she could have been an English woman who was an English child at the time in that territory, who, because of which we're about to read now, the Comenda Wars. And it says the Comenda Wars were a series of wars from 1794 until 1700s, largely between the Dutch West India Company and the English Royal African Company in the Guafo Kingdom in the present-day state of Ghana. So, and we know that the Dutch were shipping a lot of so-called slaves here in the territory that we call America, underneath the Dutch, the Dutch Trading Company. I think that's what it was called. Or the East Dutch Company. underneath the East Dutch Company. So if the Dutch and the English were warring with each other, then it is safe to say that maybe the Dutch enslaved an English child and sent her into bondage. Because we know Great Britain will send the English people into bondage. But as we can see that the Dutch and the English, or aka the British, because the British were utilizing the English rights, were fighting in the territory that we call Ghana, in the same territory that Sister Belinda Royall Sutton is so-called coming from. So, like we said, these companies could have had children, family there. They've been there so long, you can't expect and think they was going back and forth and they went to setting up shop. Of course they were. Of course. Of course. So you have to open up your mind to that. Okay? So it says, the Dutch were trying to keep the English out of the region to maintain a trade monopoly, while the English were attempting to reestablish a fort in the city of Cominda. The fighting, including forces of the Dutch West India Company, the Royal African Company, the Guelfo Kingdom, a prince of the kingdom attempting to rise to the throne, the forces of a powerful merchant named John Cabot, other Akan tribes and kingdoms like Twyfo and Dinkaria. Excuse me if I messed that up. There were 4 separate periods of warfare, including the civil war in the Guelfo Kingdom, and the wars ended with the English placing Taikia, Kuma, and Tapara in Guelfo. Because of the rapidly shifting alliances between European and African powers, historian John Thornton has found that there is no finer example of the complicated combination of European rivalry merging with African rivalry than the Cominda Wars. So, this, as we seen, is taking place in Ghana. You got the English, the Dutch, the kingdoms, the Akan tribes, and 2 kingdoms all fighting against each other. All right. Let's look at the preceding conditions. The Dutch West India Company, known as WIC, and the Guelfo Kingdom engaged in an earlier set of hostilities in 1688. The Dutch and the English had both established factories in the port city of Cominda. In 1687, the French negotiated with the King of Guelfo to open the factory in Cominda, and the WIC responded by launching its military force, the King of Guelfo, to expel the French. The Dutch tried to induce neighboring states to attack Guelfo at the same time, while the French provided gold to the king to pay the neighboring states to remain out of fighting. So as you can see, these territories were not only they fighting each other, but they also too seem to have agreements or alliances. So as we can see, as they telling us about history in regards to slavery, it's not what we all thought, that they just went straight in and start taking people. No, these are trades. Like, slavery was legal during this time. We have to accept that it was legal during this time in history, and many kingdoms and nations were doing this this atrocity, you know, as part of the human history. But as we can see, the way how they told us in regards to slavery is not the way that it truly were, based off of the history books. All right. And as you can see too, since these people were warring against each other, a lot of these folks who were enslaved were actually just prisoners of war, you know, just casualties of war, you know, collateral damage of war. So as you can see from this territory that Sister Belinda Royall Sutton is coming from, it was a lot of war taking place, not only with the indigenous people, but the trading companies. And the trading companies linking up with some of the indigenous people, tribes, and kingdoms to go against the other indigenous people, tribes, and kingdoms. And because of what was taking place, of course, they're going to take who? They're going to take anybody they can as leverage, kidnapping, and throw you into bondage. Because why? Because slavery is very lucrative. during this time. Something very lucrative, especially taking a heir from the Kingdom of England, especially the Dutch, and no telling like so who she truly really is. You know, but we know her first name is Belinda, and she was sold to a so-called slave owner in Antigua, whose mother's surname was Brown, and clearly, if his mother's surname was Brown, he had to have been Brown in the territory of Antigua, which is the Caribbean, hot territory. So I'm quite sure that he had to have been Brown too. But for the sake of the lesson, we're just going to take it for what it is and go along with it. All right. So it says, the violence resulting in the killing of the King of Woeful and the prince who allied with the Dutch was placed on the throne named Takiyi. Cominda then became largely controlled by the Dutch and their allies Twyfo. This situation gradually resulted in tensions between Takiyi and both actors. As a result, Takiyi repeatedly tried to balance English interests in the port of Cominda. All right. Let's see. All right. So once again, we see it's treated brother. It's not a treated brother. Okay, so we go back to the Royal African Company. So like it says, the company was unable to withstand competition on the terms imposed by the act in the 1708. It was talking about the Trade with Africa Act of 1697, surviving until 1750. So they was up there until 1750 at least, but it may be more. Let's go and check. In a state of much reduced activity, in 1709, Charles Davenant published Reflections upon the Constitution and Management of Trade to Africa. So remember, they were not only trading from Africa, but they were trading to Africa. And who were they trading to Africa? English people as well. Why? Because you had a House of Stuart who are now in position of power. And of course, anybody who was against the House of Stuart, which chances were going to be English people, they would do what? Send them into bondage. And we know that the British were sending English people into bondage. All right. So it says on which it reverted to his normal attitude of suspicion and outright hostility towards the Dutch. This pamphlet advocated renewing the Royal African Company's monopoly on slave trade on the basis that the Dutch competition necessitated the maintenance of forts which only a joint stock company could afford. The company continued purchasing and transporting slaves until 1731, when it abandoned slaving in favor of ivory and gold dust. From 1668 to 1722, the Royal African Company provided gold to the English mint. Coins made with such gold are designed with an elephant below the bust of the king or queen. This gold also gave the coin its name, the guinea. All right, so we can safely say that the Royal African Company, which was being ran by the British, who were utilizing the rights and the prerogatives of the English, was in the territory known today as Ghana, at least up until 1731, doing slave trade, but at least surviving in that territory to 1750 before it transferred over into a new business occupation. But during that time, Sister Belinda Royall Sutton was alive. She was in that territory before she was shipped off into Antigua. Now, in the name Belinda, it says Belinda is a feminine given name of unknown origin, apparently coined from Italian bella, meaning beautiful. Alternatively, it may be derived from the Old High German, like English, name Belinde, which possibly meant bright serpent or bright linden tree. All right, so Belinda, that's what it comes from, bright serpent or bright linden tree, which says High German, which we can conclude based off of the territory of the Royal African Company in Ghana, she potentially may have been English descent. Here's another image of her, another site. Belinda Sutton. Look at her. Definitely look like she's an English woman to me. Like they said, they know very little about many people enslaved brought to the United States. Few systematic records were kept, and when the formal system of slavery slowly fell apart in the wake of 1862 Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War, 1865, some of those deeply involved and invested in the slave trade destroyed additional records, but one formerly enslaved person we do know something about is Belinda Sutton. So we already spoke about that. Spoke about the royal family a little bit. Like I said, she's believed to have been born in what is now Ghana around 1713, which we know was in the territory of the Royal African Company. It says she was kidnapped as a child and forcibly brought to Isaac Royall's plantation in Antigua, and then to the United States to work on a royal family home in Medford, Massachusetts from 1737 to 1781. All right, so once we know that the Dutch and the English were fighting, and we know during this time they didn't really care who they were claiming, but based off of who she possibly was, chances are she was an English woman. All right. It says on account of being loyalists, the royal family fled to Nova Scotia and then to England at the beginning of the American Revolution. Belinda and others enslaved by the Royals went to Boston, where they lived in unofficial freedom. When Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1783, Belinda petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for a pension, which we already wrote about. All right. And it says in recent years, scholars have uncovered evidence that Belinda married, changing her name to Belinda Sutton. So she changed her surname from Royall to Sutton when she got married. Make sure I didn't forget anything. Let's take a look at Ghana. Ghana. Republic of Ghana. Look at the coat of arms. As you can see, it has the Lion of England in their coat of arms. Now, why is that? Why do Ghana have the Lion of coat of arms of England? The Lion of England in their coat of arms. Boy, I read about the history, and look, their official language. It's English. Official language is English. All right. And then it says the ethnic groups, 45.7% is Akan. Now, this is going to be very, very eye-opening to many brothers and sisters, especially when we're talking about the Akan. Because I did a lesson, I think, a long time ago regarding to George Washington, his surname, you know. And let me, before I end this page, before we go to that, if you want to take a look at the history of Ghana, I highly recommend you. Really good information, history, that, as you can see, that is tied to the English. And I'm not just speaking in regard to just the slave trade, but as you can see, their history is tied to the English as well. All right. Went over Prince Hall, and I remember his Back to Africa movement. Said Hall was involved in the Back to Africa movement and approached the legislature to request funds for voluntary immigration to Africa. So, in January 1773, Hall and 73 other African American delegates presented an immigration plea to the Massachusetts Senate. This plea, which included the contentions that African Americans are better suited to Africa's climate and lifestyle, it failed. When a group of freed black men had begun a trip to Africa, they were captured and held, which reignited Hall's interest in the movement. He found that there was not sufficient momentum and support for the Back to Africa movement to make it a reality at the time. Now remember, he had created the emotional ties, the genealogical ties, all mythologically created. Let's continue on this page to see something why. See, is this the one I want to show? Nope. All right, yep, so we'll bring that to the American Colonization Society. All right, so it says the American Colonization Society was an early advocate of the idea of resettling American-born blacks in Africa Now, this is stemming off of Prince Hall's Back to Africa movement. But this was founded in 1816 by Dr. Robert Finley. It was composed of two core groups, abolitionists and slave owners. Abolitionist members believed in freeing African slaves along with their descendants and providing them with the opportunity to return to Africa. Slave-owning members believed free blacks endangered the system of slavery and sought to expel them from America by means of migration. So, as you can see, they're trying to get free so-called African Americans or blacks, which we know a lot of them are the descendants from the Kingdom of England, Great Britain, and other kingdoms. But they're tying us all together and trying to have us sent to Africa, which we know that Africa at the time, before the American Revolution, was underneath the Royal African Company, as well as the Dutch East Indian Company and various other trading companies that were dealing with slavery. And Great Britain abolished slavery, but that didn't mean the rest of them did. And that was done in 1807. So it says, since its inception, American colonization society struggled to garner support from within free black communities. During the late 1840s and early 1850s, the creation of independent Liberian states splintered the nearly uniform voice against colonization. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 provided the United States government ample power to recapture fugitive slaves. Following its passage, many black leaders promoted immigration and colonization to a nation that would provide and protect their rights. In spite of this, several black critics were outspoken against the Back to Africa, pay attention, movement and activities of the American Colonization Society. A report from a free black political conference in New York warned all kinds of chicanery and stratagem will be employed to lure the people to the colony. The independence of its inhabitants, the enjoyment and privileges of its citizens will be pictured forth in glowing colors to deceive you. So they're telling you, melanated people back in the 1800s, even the late 1700s, 1800s, were telling them, don't let them deceive you to try to get you to go to so-called Africa. They told you that back then that they were going to do that, and they're showing you today with these new terminologies that they're trying to get you to not be the original people, i.e. the heirs who's supposed to be here. But let's not go into that. Just don't want you to pay attention to what's being said. So it says, according to the Encyclopedia of Georgia History and Culture, as early as 1820, black Americans had begun to return to their ancestral homeland through the auspices of the American Colonization Society. By 1847, the American Colonization Society founded Liberia, a land to be settled by black people returning from the United States of America. All right, then you can read the rest of that, but you can see they were trying to tell them, don't do it. Let me see. So let me see. All right, so it says, this is what I wanted to read. So it said, the emergence of the Back to Africa movement. Much of the African American population was free people seeking opportunity. Many Southern free blacks migrated to the industrial North to seek employment, while others moved to surrounding Southern states. No one anywhere wanted them. They were seen as perpetual foreigners. So they're saying melanated people, aka black people, were seen as perpetual foreigners. By working for less, took jobs from citizens, whites were not used to sharing space with blacks in the context outside of chattel slavery. Many did not believe that free blacks had a place in America. Let's see. Okay, and that's what I wanted to read on that part. This is the opposition from African Americans on the American Colonization Society. It says, from the beginning, the majority of black Americans regarded the society with enormous disdain, a fixed hatred. Black activist James Fortin immediately rejected the ACS, writing in 1817 that we have no wish to separate from our present homes for any purpose whatever. As soon as they heard about it, 3,000 black protesters packed a church in Philadelphia, the bellwether city for free blacks, and bitterly unanimously denounced it. They published a protest pamphlet. Now, after the colonization society has been formed without the consent of the colored people, after the enterprise had been violently published against their reiterated protests for 17 years after its friends acknowledged that coercion has been used in getting away its victims, and so long as they will persuade us that this is not the native country of colored Americans and that we ought not to let them remain here, what is better than gross mockery to talk about consent? So the melanated folks are upset, they're outraged by this American colonization society trying to get us to go to so-called Africa. And then as we just read, that Prince Hall, who has the #1 African lodge that he got from England, so clearly that he knew, because he was already alive during the time of the British colonization as well as the Treaty of Paris. So he knew what was going on. He was literate, and he was the one that wrote the petition for Sister Belinda Royall Sutton and said that she was from Africa. So clearly that there's some type of deception going on to try to tie us, all melanated people, to so-called Africa. And as you can see, if we were from Africa, I'm quite sure these brothers and sisters, especially all of the atrocity that was going on here in America during slavery time, would have went there. But as we already read from the free Negroes, that there was free Negroes during the British colonization, which we can see went all the way back to the so-called 1600s, and even all the way afterwards, all the way up until the Emancipation Proclamation of 1865. So they already knew who they were. These folks knew who they were. Everybody wasn't illiterate, even though the 1740 Anti-Literacy Act, it prevented the teachings of so-called free and not free so-called melanated people, depending on what territory. Depending on what territory, because we can see the Prince Hall was literate, and he was in Massachusetts, and he was part of the free black population. So clearly, they knew. This wasn't something that was hidden. They knew. Now we want to know why. Maybe can be explained in this video. We might see a little bit more information regarding the switcheroo that's taking place. Let's continue. It says Frederick Douglass condemned colonization. Shame upon the guilty wretches that dare propose in all that continents such a proposition. We live here, have lived here, have a right to live here, and mean to live here. This is for Frederick Douglass, and we know Frederick Douglass knew his Anglo-Saxon paternity. He knew it, and he spoke upon it. All right. It says Martin Delany, who believed that black Americans deserved a new country, a new beginning, called Liberia a miserable mockery of an independent republic, a racist scheme of the ACS to rid the United States of free blacks. He proposed and said Central and South America is the ultimate destination and future home of the colored race on his continent. All right. And the rest of this, he says, a recent 2014 writer on Connecticut African Americans summarizes the attitude amongst them. African Americans view colonization as a means of defrauding them of their rights of citizenship and their right of tightening the grip of slavery. The tragedy was that African Americans began to view their ancestral home with disdain. They dropped the use of African in the names of their organizations and used, instead of African American, the colored American. While claiming to aid African Americans in some cases to stimulate immigration, and made conditions for them worse. For example, the society assumed the task of resuscitating the Ohio Black Codes of 1804 and 1807. Between 1,000 and 1,200 free blacks were forced from Cincinnati. Meeting held in Cincinnati on January 1782 to discuss colonization, which resulted in a series of resolutions. And the rest of this, brothers and sisters, you can read on your own. And let me see. That's an image of Charles II. Easier to see. easier to see. But Charles II, House of Stuart, one started the Royal African Company, utilizing the rights and prerogatives of the English. Let me see the Royal Slave Quarters. Let me see anything in here. This is the petition. It was done February 14th, 1783. So clearly, like I said, during the time of Prince Hall's, which he knew what was taking place, and the lodge was about to be started a whole year from that. All right, so it says to the Honorable Senate House of Representatives, I'm not even going to read it, but it says the petition of Belinda African Humbly Shoes, and you can see at the beginning, he speaks very well about the location, and then starts speaking about what happened in regards to getting kidnapped. Alright, so you can read the rest of this, get an idea of what was going on regarding the petition, that which I feel Prince Hall did right, because of he knew that a lot of these brothers and sisters were from England, and they weren't going to allow them to be which we call so-called loyalists, because a lot of them were the descendants of loyalists as well. But that's for a whole nother topic or another lesson. So once again, brothers and sisters, who is Belinda Royall Sutton? Do you feel that she was actually truly a Ghanaian local, or was she truly an English heir, English child who was placed in bondage from the war that was taking place between the English and the Dutch, as well as the kingdoms in Africa and the local tribes? That is something that you definitely need to keep your mind open in regards to. Here's the Trade with Africa Act of 1697. As you can see, it didn't get repealed until 1867. So it says the Trade with Africa Act 1697, also known as the Act to Settle the Trade to Africa. So the Act of Trade to Africa, which we're telling you they were trading not just so-called to get gold and spices and ivory, but they were trading people. So it says the Trade to Africa was a law passed by the Parliament of England to officially revoke the monopoly enjoyed by the Royal African Company, that's the RAC, on English trade with Africa, which included the Atlantic slave trade. Instead, the act introduced taxation of those involved in the triangular trade, whereby merchants will be liable to pay 10% tax for the maintenance of the forts and castles between Cape Mount and Cape of Good Hope. All right, just say South Africa, brothers and sisters, and in the coast, which belonged to the RAC. The new regulations came into effect on June 24th, 1698. And the act begins with the following. Just pay attention. Whereas the trade to Africa is highly beneficial and advantageous to this kingdom and to the plantations and colonies thereunto belonging, and whereas forts and castles are undoubtedly necessary for the preservation and well carrying on the said trade, and whereas the forts and castles now on the said coast of Africa have been and now are maintained at them sole cost in charge of the present Royal African Company of England, towards which charge is most reasonable that all persons trading to such ports of the said coast of Africa as are hereinafter limited and appointed should contribute. Be it therefore enacted by the King's most excellent majesty, and by and with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal and commons in the Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, that from and after the 4th and 20th day of June in the year 1698, the said Royal African Company, their successors and assigns, by and with their stock and duties herein after appointed to be paid, shall maintain, support, and defend all such forts, castles as the said African Company now have in their possession, or shall hereafter purchase or erect for the preservation, improvement, and well carrying on the said trade, and those forts and castles from time to time, and at all times hereafter on occasion shall require, shall supply with men, artillery, ammunition, and provision, and all other necessaries and incident charges whatsoever. And it says, among the provisions, the act opened the African trade to all English merchants who paid a 10% levy to the Royal African Company on all goods exported from Africa. The company was unable to withstand competition on the terms imposed by the act in 1708, became insolvent, surviving until 1750 in a stage of much reduced activity. So once again, brothers and sisters, there you have it. The Royal African Company, which was transferred underneath the Parliament of England, which has existed not only from 1616, which was the institution of the restoration of the Stuarts, Charles II, but lasted all the way up until 1750. During this time frame, when do we know that Sister, get back to her, we know that Sister Belinda Royall Sutton, let's put this on up. We know Sister Belinda Royall Sutton, she existed there. As you see, her age, time says 1713, 1799. So when she was kidnapped at around the age of 12, she was, like I said, it was underneath the territories underneath the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of England, who was been running it underneath the British monarchs who were running, excuse me. And she was sent to the British colonies of Antigua, which we know is in the Caribbean, and clearly this brother Isaac Royall, been born by Elizabeth Brown, which her surname denotes to her complexion, clearly had to be of a brown complexion or a brown hue as well. Left Sister Belinda Sutton, or Belinda Royall Sutton, I was going to say, documentation for her freedom. And in regards to her documentation for her freedom, she filed a petition for her to receive pay for the her being placed in bondage. And as we can say, especially if she was placed in bondage as a prisoner of war, then it will make sense why she should have got reparations. But it wouldn't be underneath the title of her being an African, but a title of her being an English woman or an English child or descendant from the Kingdom of England, Great Britain, who was placed in bondage and thrown underneath the slave status, which we can say through the Isaac household. And unfortunately, or fortunately, she was able to get freed from there because he, like they said, fled to Nova Scotia because he was considered a loyalist. And we know that there was also black loyalists. But for the sake of the video, we can't say that she was a loyalist, but we can conclude, or I can conclude, that she had to have been an English heir. So what you think, brothers and sisters, please leave down there at the bottom of the video. This will be the end of that. Please like, share, subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. Also, too, if you like the information that we're presenting, because the goal is to help those long-lost English heirs and descendants be resurrected to be counted amongst those of the living. You know, we are in a state of emergency. That's the reason why we are doing these lessons, to bring them out there for those of you who need to hear it the most. And if you can see yourself within me, as well within Sister Belinda Royall Sutton, then you should know that you are right and exact the place where you need to be. Trace your genealogy, so therefore you can start becoming more comfortable in being who you truly are, because we are Anglo-Saxon Berbers, or many people can say Anglo-Berbers, because it still denotes to our English nationality and our Berber ancestry, or which we call ethnicity. So with that being said, if you want to go ahead and send any other information to us, make sure you send it to the email, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Peace. Love you. Take care.